Step into a world where every glance, every gesture, and even the way you held your teacup could determine your reputation. Imagine waking up not in the comfort of our modern era, but in the heart of Victorian London, a society where appearances shaped destiny and unspoken rules governed every corner of daily life. Welcome, friends, to another journey through history's most fascinating and mysterious chapters. If you enjoy unraveling forgotten customs, hidden stories, and the delicate social codes that shape people's lives, then you are in the right place. Don't forget to support the channel by leaving a like and subscribing, so you will never miss the next adventure into the past. Now, picture this. The year is 1850. London is alive with the sound of horse-drawn carriages rattling across cobblestone streets, the haze of coal smoke drifting in the morning air, and the hum of conversations behind velvet curtains in grand drawing rooms. Life looks elegant on the surface, yet beneath that polished exterior lies a society weighed down by invisible chains, rules of behavior so strict that a single misstep could lead to scandal. In this world, nothing is simple. A morning greeting had its own ritual. A polite call could last exactly 15 minutes, never shorter, never longer. Even the scent you carried was judged. A light hint of citrus was admired, but anything stronger was whispered about as vulgar. Romance was never just romance. It was a performance, a chess game, where both men and women had to move with strategy, subtlety, and restraint. But here is where the story becomes even more intriguing. The Victorian age was not only about rules, it was also about rebellion, though often in the smallest and quietest forms. Behind every rule, there was someone bending it. Behind every polite smile, there might be a spark of defiance. And behind the stiff corsets and endless etiquette, there were real people dreaming, longing, and searching for connection in a world determined to control them. Over the course of this episode, we are going to step into their shoes. From the moment of waking up in a chilly Victorian bedroom, to the rituals of breakfast, the secret language of courtship, and the tension-filled dance of dinner parties and engagements, we will experience firsthand how society shaped love, friendship, even simple daily choices. By the end, you may find yourself questioning whether you could have thrived even within such a web of expectations. Settle in, and let us begin our exploration of what it truly meant to live, to love, and to maintain honor in the Victorian age. And remember, if you find these glimpses into the past as fascinating as I do, your support means the world. A like helps this story reach more curious minds, and subscribing ensures you are always the first to uncover history's next secret with us. Now, are you ready? Let us open the velvet curtains, step past the polished silverware, and enter the drawing rooms of Victorian London. As the curtains of the 19th century part before your eyes, the dim light of dawn filters into a narrow bedroom in the heart of London. The fire in the grate has long gone cold, leaving the air brisk enough that every breath you take is visible, a faint mist dissolving into the chill. The bed you lie upon is heavy with layered quilts, stitched by hand, their weight both comforting and confining. There is no electric hum, no morning buzz from a phone, no glow of a digital screen, only the distant clatter of hooves echoing down cobblestone streets, the muffled calls of market vendors already preparing their stalls, and the low groan of carriages as they pass beneath your window. It is 1850, and the world around you is a symphony of sound and silence that is both strangely foreign and hauntingly intimate. You rise slowly, not in the casual ease of our modern mornings, but with the knowledge that even the act of dressing is bound by unspoken expectations. In the corner of the room, garments are neatly folded, layers upon layers of fabric awaiting your patience. For men, the ritual of buttoning crisp shirts, fastening waistcoats, and tying cravats demands precision, for each detail speaks of discipline and respectability. For women, the process is far more complex. Corsets tightened until breaths become shallow, skirts fastened one over another until the body itself seems reshaped into society's ideal of elegance. Dressing is not merely practical. It is a declaration, a silent performance of one's place in the world. To appear careless, even in small ways, could set tongues wagging and reputations trembling. Stepping into the day, you notice that the city outside lives according to rhythms both rigid and graceful. Chimneys exhale plumes of coal smoke into the morning sky, blending with the fog that rolls off the Thames. While street lamps, still flickering from the night before, glow faintly against the pale dawn. London is not just a city of grandeur but a city of contrast, where wealth and poverty brush shoulders in narrow lanes and bustling markets. A lady in velvet sweeps past in her carriage, her gloved hand resting lightly on the window, while a barefoot child sells matches on the corner, his face streaked with soot. Yet both inhabit the same social maze. For though their worlds appear separate, each is constrained by rules of propriety that govern interactions. Appearances, and even the smallest gestures of daily life. Breakfast awaits. But it is not taken in haste. In wealthier homes, it unfolds as a quiet ceremony, china cups arranged neatly, silver polished until it gleams, conversations restrained and courteous, toasted bread and eggs, lightly salted porridge, perhaps smoked fish or fresh fruit if the season allows. Even here, the way you sit, the way you lift your spoon, the way you speak, all of it is noticed, all of it remembered. For the Victorians, meals are not simply nourishment but opportunities for subtle displays of refinement. In modest households, breakfast is simpler, yet the same sense of order persists. Prayers murmured before eating, children seated upright, manners reinforced at every bite. The table is a stage, and every participant, whether rich or poor, is expected to play their part with dignity. As you sip a warm cup of tea, its steam curling into the morning air, you realize that nothing in this world is left untouched by ritual. From the garments on your back to the way you exchange greetings on the street, each moment is saturated with invisible codes. In the Victorian age, life is not only lived but carefully choreographed, and while it may appear stifling to our modern sensibilities, there is also a strange beauty in its rhythm. It is a world that asks you not only to exist but to perform, to embody ideals larger than yourself, and to find meaning even in the smallest acts of daily living. The atmosphere around you feels heavier than what you are accustomed to, almost as though the room itself is holding its breath in quiet expectation. The bedroom is cold, not with the crisp freshness of modern air conditioning, but with a damp chill that seeps into your bones. Carried in by the stone walls and the lingering London fog that creeps through every crack and seam of the window frame. The mattress beneath you is filled with horsehair, its texture firm and unyielding, reminding you that comfort in this era is relative and often secondary to practicality. As you shift slightly, the sheets rasp against your skin, the cotton coarse and scratchy compared to the softness of modern fabrics, reminding you with every movement that luxury is rare and earned. Heavy velvet drapes hang solemnly at the window, their folds thick enough to block the weak rays of dawn, but also trapping the stagnant air of the room, which carries the faint, acrid tang of coal smoke drifting in from the street. That smoky presence is not confined to the outdoors. It infiltrates every space, clinging to clothing, to hair, to the very fibers of the curtains. So that even within these private walls you are never entirely separated from the pulse of the industrial city outside. The air you breathe carries with it not only the scent of burning coal, but also a subtle weight, an invisible reminder of a metropolis that lives and breathes industry, power, and progress at the expense of clarity and comfort. Even the silence of the room is layered, broken by the muffled clip-clop of hooves against the cobblestones below, the distant rumble of carriage wheels, and the occasional creak of timber settling as though the house itself shares in the city's restless rhythm. Nothing feels sterile. Nothing feels untouched. Instead, everything is infused with texture, with history, with the physical reality of a world where each surface bears a story, and every breath draws in the essence of Victorian life. As the dim light of morning struggles to seep past the heavy velvet curtains, you are not the one to rise first. For in this world, the rhythms of daily life are shaped not only by the ticking of clocks, but also by the presence of those whose labor sustains the household. The sound of a careful knock at the door precedes the quiet entrance of Mary, the young maid assigned to your room, whose presence is a reminder that in Victorian society, even the most intimate moments of waking are entangled with class and hierarchy. She moves with practiced efficiency, drawing back the curtains to let in the pale, smoky light of dawn. And with that simple gesture, the room is transformed from a cavern of shadows into a stage upon which the day begins. The faint glow illuminates her modest dress, the plain fabric and apron a stark contrast to the heavier garments she lays out at the foot of your bed, carefully chosen to reflect your social standing rather than personal comfort. As she shakes out the folds of a waistcoat or smooths the hem of a dress, her actions speak of a world in which appearances are not merely personal choices, but declarations of identity, each stitch and button carrying silent weight in the social order. Mary does not linger to converse. Her duties are too many, her movements too disciplined, but in her quiet presence lies an entire story of a life shaped by service, where the boundaries between her own desires and the expectations of the household blur into near invisibility. She knows the routine by heart, the exact way to adjust the curtains so the light falls gently across the room, the precise arrangement of garments so that dressing may proceed without delay, the silent tidying of objects left askew so that everything reflects the ordered harmony demanded by those above. For you, she is a background figure, her labor designed to fade into the rhythm of your day. But for her, each moment is a carefully measured step in a long choreography that defines not only her livelihood but her place within a rigidly structured society. The servant system is not simply about convenience. It is a mirror of Victorian values, an embodiment of the era's insistence on hierarchy and discipline. And as Mary slips quietly from the room to attend to her next task, she leaves behind an atmosphere in which privilege and dependence, visibility and invisibility, are woven seamlessly together. When Mary lays out your clothing for the morning, you are reminded once more of the unspoken codes that govern every gesture and every garment in Victorian society. For even within the sanctuary of the bedroom, modesty is a rule that hovers like an ever-watchful presence. The nightgown you slip from is not a garment designed for comfort alone, but a statement of propriety, buttoned high to the chin so that not even the graceful line of a collarbone might be revealed, its long sleeves extending to cover the wrists so that the most ordinary signs of the body are veiled away. To modern sensibilities, the idea that the simple sight of a wrist or a neck could invite whispers of impropriety might seem curious. But in this era it is understood instinctively, a silent agreement shared by all that modesty must be preserved as fiercely in private life as in public. The very fabrics chosen for nightwear are plain and functional, avoiding anything that could be mistaken for extravagance or allure. Because the body was not something to be hinted at, much less displayed, outside the strict confines of marriage and duty. As you fasten the final buttons, you feel the weight of these customs pressing as firmly as the garments themselves, for they do not exist merely to cover flesh but to shape identity, to discipline thought, to remind one's self of the boundary between virtue and scandal that society so carefully polices. The neck hidden beneath layers of cotton, the wrist swaddled in fabric, the very curve of the figure concealed beneath loose folds, all these become symbols of restraint. A restraint that is at once moral, social, and profoundly physical. It is not simply your own reputation that such modesty protects, but the honor of the household and, by extension, the image of an entire class that thrives on the appearance of dignity, even in these earliest hours of the day. Before stepping beyond the threshold of your room, you are already inhabiting a world where every detail of your attire, from the length of a sleeve to the fastening of a button, carries meaning far beyond yourself, enforcing a code of silence around the body and its desires. Once the buttons are neatly fastened and the folds of fabric arranged just so, another detail of preparation presents itself, one so subtle that it might seem trivial. Yet in the rigid world of Victorian propriety it is as significant as the garments themselves. The choice of fragrance, though invisible, speaks as loudly as any word or gesture. For in this era scent is not merely a personal preference, but a declaration of refinement, restraint, and respectability. The air of your room still carries the faint weight of coal smoke drifting from the street, a reminder of the city's ceaseless industry. And it is against this backdrop that a carefully chosen perfume becomes not just adornment but protection, a veil of delicacy meant to soften the harshness of the outside world. But here, extravagance is dangerous, and the rules of etiquette are strict. Heavy perfumes, thick with musky sweetness or overpowering floral blends, are dismissed as vulgar. Indulgent, even suggestive of moral looseness, their cloying presence more scandalous than alluring. Instead, the most acceptable choices are light, fleeting, and restrained fragrances that suggest freshness rather than seduction, purity rather than passion, a touch of lemon essence dabbed at the wrists, or perhaps a whisper of bergamot behind the ear, offers the perfect balance. A quiet signal of refinement that lingers just enough to be noticed without ever demanding attention. These scents, crisp and delicate, evoke the idea of cleanliness and order, aligning with the very values that structure Victorian life. To wear such a fragrance is not simply to smell pleasant, but to embody an entire moral philosophy in which restraint is elegance and subtlety is power. As you consider which vial to unstop, you are not merely choosing how you will smell throughout the day, you are choosing how you will be perceived, how you will be judged, and ultimately, how you will navigate a society that weighs every detail, no matter how intangible, against the exacting standards of propriety. The perfume becomes less an accessory than a silent companion, accompanying you as you step out into a world where every breath carries with it an unspoken expectation of who you are meant to be. With the faint trace of citrus still lingering in the air, you turn toward the garments awaiting you, and it becomes immediately clear that what you are about to put on is not simply clothing, but a carefully constructed language, one that speaks for you long before you utter a single word. In Victorian society, attire is never merely fabric draped over the body. It is a coded message, a living script that communicates to the world your place in the rigid hierarchy of class, your adherence to the unwritten laws of propriety, and even your claim to personal morality. To dress is to declare allegiance to an entire social order, for every stitch, every fold, and every accessory is judged not only on its beauty, but on the subtle signals it conveys. A gown too elaborate for the hour might whisper of vanity. A hemline too short could provoke suspicion of impropriety, while garments that are too plain risk suggesting neglect, poverty, or even indifference to the standards that keep society in balance. The corset that Mary laces with practiced precision is not merely a foundation garment, but a visible marker of discipline, a tangible reminder that the body itself must conform to society's expectations, cinched and molded into an approved silhouette that reflects both restraint and control. The chemise. Petticoats, bodice, and skirts that follow are layered like unspoken promises, each one adding weight not just to your form, but to the performance of identity you must carry into the day. The choice of color and fabric is equally deliberate, for dark hues speak of sobriety and duty, while pale shades suggest youth and innocence, and fine silks or velvets announce wealth with a confidence that cotton cannot convey. Even the smallest detail, the trim of a cuff, the placement of a ribbon, the choice between gloves of kid leather or simple wool becomes a kind of vocabulary through which society reads you, evaluates you, and decides how you are to be treated. In this world, to dress carelessly is to risk misunderstanding, for clothing is as much a declaration of loyalty to morality as it is an expression of taste. A well-chosen ensemble assures others that you are respectable, disciplined, and trustworthy, while any hint of excess or neglect could unravel that carefully maintained impression. Thus, as the last fastenings are secured, and you feel the full weight of the garments settle upon you, you are not simply clothed, you are armored, scripted, and silently announced to the world, ready to step into a society where appearance does not merely reflect reality but actively shapes it, ensuring that every gaze cast upon you finds not just a person, but a message carefully woven in thread. Once dressed and properly adorned, you are not simply prepared for the day, you are prepared for the script that Victorian society demands you perform. For life here is not a matter of spontaneous choices, but of carefully observed rituals that lend rhythm, order, predictability to existence. The day unfolds like a play, each act already written, each participant bound by conventions that govern where one should be, how one should appear, and what one should say. After breakfast, often a modest affair of tea, toast, and perhaps eggs or porridge, The morning is quickly overtaken by what are known as morning calls, a ritual so central to social life that neglecting it would mark one as indifferent, if not outright rude. These visits, often lasting no more than 15 minutes, are not intended for leisurely conversation but rather for the exchange of polite formalities, the careful maintenance of connections, and the subtle reinforcement of one's standing within the community. A calling card left at the door speaks volumes about your attentiveness and respectability, and the precise timing of your visits, neither too early nor too late, signals your understanding of the unspoken rules that hold this social fabric together. By afternoon, the pace of the day shifts, and another ritual takes its place, one that has since become synonymous with Victorian culture itself: tea. Yet in its original context, afternoon tea is not merely a refreshment but a social performance, a moment when refinement is displayed in the handling of delicate porcelain cups, the offering of cakes and sandwiches, and the graceful exchange of conversation that avoids anything too controversial or too intimate, instead lingering on acceptable topics such as the weather, literature, or recent public events. To be invited to tea is to be recognized as a valued participant in society, and to host it successfully is to demonstrate not just hospitality but competence in navigating the invisible rules that govern interaction. Every detail matters: the arrangement of the table, the quality of the brew, the elegance with which it is poured, each element combining to create an atmosphere in which reputation is both built and affirmed. The routine may appear rigid, even stifling, yet to those who live within it, it offers stability, a sense of purpose, and a constant reassurance that one is moving in step with the expectations of the time. Every call, every exchange of pleasantries, every cup of tea is a thread woven into the broader fabric of life, a daily choreography that reaffirms order and belonging in a society where deviation is noticed, whispered about, and rarely forgiven. And so the day advances, shaped less by personal desire than by the intricate dance of tradition, until evening approaches and brings with it yet another set of rituals to be observed. Curiously, the very ritual referred to as morning calls is something of a misnomer, for despite its name, these visits do not take place in the morning at all, but rather in the late afternoon, usually between the hours of 3 and 5, when the day has settled into a steady rhythm and society turns its attention to the delicate art of maintaining appearances. At this appointed time, carriages begin to line the streets of fashionable neighborhoods, their wheels clattering against cobblestones as footmen assist well-dressed callers, who arrive not with the intention of lingering, but with the clear understanding that these visits are to be short, structured, and precise. The very brevity of the call, 15 minutes, and not a moment more, is part of its elegance, a carefully measured display of respect, enough to remind one's hosts that they are valued, yet restrained enough to avoid overstaying and thereby imposing upon their time. Within those fleeting minutes, the ritual unfolds with a kind of theatrical precision. Gloves are kept on or removed depending on the formality of the occasion. Greetings are exchanged with polished civility, and conversation is chosen with the utmost care, never wandering into the realms of gossip too sharp or opinions too bold, but remaining firmly within the safe borders of society's acceptable topics. A word about the weather, a comment on a recent musical performance, or the most cautious acknowledgement of a shared acquaintance is sufficient to fulfill the purpose. Even the act of presenting one's calling card, engraved with impeccable script, is a statement in itself, an emblem of refinement and a silent reminder that one has adhered to the expectations of courtesy. The entire practice may seem, to modern eyes, unnecessarily rigid. Yet in the context of the Victorian world it is anything but trivial. These calls are the invisible threads that keep the fabric of relationships intact, a delicate network of connections that sustains reputation, cements alliances, and ensures one's place within the hierarchy of society. To neglect them is to risk invisibility. To observe them is to affirm one's belonging. And so, in the quiet drawing rooms where curtains filter the afternoon light and porcelain cups are poised beside the faint aroma of tea, the drama of status and recognition is played out in miniature. Each 15-minute visit another scene in the elaborate performance that is Victorian life. What makes these afternoon visits all the more delicate is not simply the exchange of polite words or the presentation of a finely embossed card, but the absolute precision with which time must be observed. For in the Victorian world, punctuality is not merely a virtue, it is a form of silent language, an unspoken code that reveals one's respect for others as clearly as any spoken compliment. To arrive too early is to risk unsettling the household. To suggest impatience or even desperation for attention. To arrive too late is to imply indifference. A lack of regard that might plant the smallest seed of offense in a society where reputation thrives on subtleties. But most perilous of all is the length of one's stay. For in this sphere of rigid decorum, even the difference of a few minutes carries weight. 15 minutes is the accepted measure, the golden balance between courtesy and imposition. And to remain longer than this sanctioned span is to intrude upon the fragile rhythm of your host's day. A fox pass that can quietly diminish one's standing in ways more lasting than words could repair. Equally, to take one's leave too quickly is just as damaging, for it signals disinterest, a lack of genuine engagement, and even the suspicion that your host is of insufficient importance to merit your time. Guests and hosts alike are acutely aware of these invisible boundaries. And so every glance at the mantel clock, every subtle pause in conversation, carries with it an unspoken awareness of the passing moments. The drawing room becomes a kind of stage upon which timing itself is the performance. And mastery of this performance requires a delicate balance of attentiveness, restraint, and social instinct. Those who manage it with grace earn admiration for their refinement. Those who falter may find that doors, once open, begin to close with quiet finality. Thus, in this world of rigid propriety, the measure of one's character can be read not only in the cut of one's coat or the tone of one's conversation, but in the precise moment when one rises from a chair, bows with courtesy, and departs at just the right time, neither too soon nor too late, but at the perfect interval that secures one's place in the intricate clockwork of Victorian society. And so, after the carefully timed rituals of calling and visiting, the household returns to its own private sphere. Yet even here the same laws of restraint and ceremony dictate each moment. And nowhere is this more evident than at the breakfast table, where what might seem, in another age or culture, to be the most ordinary and unguarded of family gatherings becomes instead a theater of manners, discipline, and silent judgment. The morning sun filters weakly through lace curtains, falling across a table laid with the quiet precision of polished silver, porcelain cups, and starched linen, each placement exact, each element arranged with an order that reflects not only a love of beauty but a determination to maintain control. Family members gather not for warmth or easy conversation but to demonstrate composure, to display the very qualities of restraint, attentiveness, and refinement that the world beyond the front door will demand of them. Every gesture is watched, every small action silently measured against an unspoken code. The way one sits, the angle of the back straight against the chair, the placement of the napkin, the manner in which bread is buttered or tea is stirred, all these things, minor though they may appear, are scrutinized with the seriousness of moral conduct. For in the Victorian mind, self-mastery at the breakfast table signals the capacity for self-mastery in every aspect of life. Conversation, if it occurs, is subdued, carried with careful politeness, and never allowed to stray into frivolity or undue enthusiasm, as raised voices or laughter might be considered disruptive. Even indecorous children, when present, are expected to be silent, their role not to contribute but to observe, to absorb the invisible lessons of order, patience, and propriety that will shape them into adults worthy of their station. This meal, taken in the supposed intimacy of family, is in truth as much a performance as any dinner party or social call, for it reflects not just the bonds of kinship but the values of an entire culture built upon the twin pillars of control and respectability. To fail in these small domestic rituals is to reveal a weakness that may ripple outward into the wider sphere, suggesting instability or carelessness, qualities that a society obsessed with order can neither forgive nor forget. Thus, even in the quiet of morning, as the household shares bread, tea, and the faint comfort of routine, The air is thick with the awareness that every glance, every word, every motion, no matter how small, is part of the ongoing rehearsal for a life lived under constant observation. Yet, if the breakfast table serves as a silent stage for the practice of restraint within the home, the arena of courtship demands an even greater mastery of subtlety. For here every glance, every word, and every pause carries a weight far heavier than the silver spoons or porcelain cups of the morning meal. In the world of Victorian society, love, if it could be called that, was never a matter of impulsive passion, but of delicate maneuvering. Careful signals, and a choreography of manners so elaborate that even the simplest conversation might conceal a dozen layers of unspoken meaning. Imagine, then, an afternoon where you are introduced to a gentleman such as Thomas Fairchild, perhaps a figure of respectable lineage, his demeanor polished, his intentions opaque, and the very air between you charged with the silent understanding that the smallest misstep could damage not just your own reputation, but that of your entire family. Directness is a luxury never permitted, for express feeling openly is to risk being thought reckless or unrefined, and so communication takes place in fragments, in careful gestures of modesty and reserve, a lowered gaze, the faintest of smiles, the deliberate slowness in accepting an offered hand to assist with a chair. These small details become the very language of affection, one that is simultaneously honest and coded, passionate and restrained. Words are chosen with surgical care, never revealing too much, never stepping beyond the invisible boundary where polite interest shades into impropriety. For the courtship of this age is less a free exploration of emotion and more a negotiation, one whose stakes involve not just hearts but wealth, position, and the preservation of social standing. Even the settings in which such interactions unfold are meticulously orchestrated, with drawing rooms, promenades, and afternoon teas serving as sanctioned spaces where men and women might converse under the ever-watchful eyes of family members or trusted companions. Privacy is not permitted, for to be alone together would be to invite suspicion, and so romance must exist in the narrow corridors of permissible observation, where every interaction is at once guarded and intensely scrutinized. And yet, within these confines, there thrives a tension, a kind of restrained electricity that heightens rather than diminishes the encounter. For when the rules forbid excess, the heart learns to find exhilaration in the smallest breach. The faint brush of fingertips when a glove is returned, the lingering of an eye contact just 1 second too long, the choice of a phrase that, though innocent on the surface, carries a hidden warmth. All these moments shimmer with a vitality made stronger by their rarity. Thus, to engage in courtship during this time is to navigate a labyrinth where desire must always be cloaked in modesty, where honesty must disguise itself as formality, and where every encounter is both a test and a performance. A woman must learn to balance the appearance of reserve with the hint of receptivity, to be at once virtuous and approachable, while a man like Thomas Fairchild must demonstrate not only genuine interest, but also the patience and discipline to pursue it within the strict boundaries imposed upon him. And in this elaborate dance, the true drama lies not in the declarations never spoken aloud, but in the silences that hover between words, in the gestures that escape notice by most yet speak volumes to the one whom they are intended. And yet, if the art of courtship demands discretion in every gesture, then perhaps its most intricate requirement lies not in what one does, but in what one must avoid revealing. In the delicate theater of Victorian society, the heart was not permitted the freedom of unguarded display, for even the most innocent flush upon the cheek could be seized upon as evidence of unbecoming eagerness. To blush too brightly at a gentleman's remark, to allow the eyes to linger with visible warmth, or to betray through nervous laughter a trace of true feeling, these were not charming signs of sincerity, but rather warnings, hints of impropriety that might render a young woman vulnerable to whispers and judgment. A lady was expected to master herself so thoroughly that her emotions became an invisible current beneath the surface, felt only by her and perhaps guessed at by the most perceptive observer, but never so obvious as to give society any cause to question her restraint. This cultivation of composure was not mere preference, but a necessity, for reputation was a fragile treasure in the Victorian world, one that could be shattered by something as fleeting as an uncontrolled reaction. A young woman must learn, almost from childhood, to keep her face calm, her voice measured, her body still, as though every interaction unfolded upon a stage where the audience was always watching, and where even the smallest slip might alter the course of her future. In this way, modesty became not simply a virtue but a shield, protecting her from accusations of forwardness and ensuring that her worth was judged not by the vulnerability of her feelings, but by the dignity of her restraint. Imagine, then, sitting across from Thomas Fairchild as he speaks with polished courtesy, perhaps offering a remark intended to test your reaction. You feel the rush of warmth that rises unbidden in your chest, the quickening of breath that betrays the stirrings of genuine interest, and yet you know that to reveal it openly would be dangerous. Instead, you compose yourself with the practiced art of stillness, lowering your eyes with just enough poise to suggest modest acknowledgement, allowing a faint, almost imperceptible smile to flicker before vanishing into serenity. It is not indifference you project, but balance, a careful equilibrium between attentiveness and detachment that keeps the conversation alive without ever stepping beyond the boundaries of propriety. Such restraint was not merely for the sake of appearance, but part of the larger game in which both men and women participated, a game in which mystery held more power than transparency, and where the allure of what was hidden far outweighed the satisfaction of what was revealed. To maintain control was to command respect, and to command respect was to secure the very foundation upon which one's future might rest. Thus, every unblushed cheek, every measured tone, every carefully timed silence became not a denial of feeling but a sophisticated form of expression, one that elevated desire into an art form where the strongest emotions lived not in the words spoken aloud but in the quiet discipline of those left unspoken. And just as one must guard against betraying too much through blushes or glances, so too must the tongue itself be carefully restrained. For in the Victorian drawing-room conversation was never a simple exchange of words, but a delicate performance governed by rules so precise that a single misstep might cast an unwelcome shadow. One did not speak merely to fill silence, nor to give voice to private passions, but to demonstrate refinement, restraint, and a balanced mind, for the content of one's remarks was seen as a mirror of one's character. Thus, the boundaries of discussion were narrow, and within those boundaries, one had to navigate with elegance, steering clear of anything that might stir undue fervor or suggest a lapse in composure. The safest ground was the weather, that endlessly shifting yet universally shared phenomenon, which provided an inexhaustible source of polite remarks. To note with calm interest the gentle drizzle of the morning, or the brightness of a rare clear afternoon, was to place oneself upon secure footing, for no one could take offense at such observations, and yet the tone in which they were delivered might reveal poise or awkwardness, refinement or clumsiness. Beyond this, one might venture into the realm of sermons recently heard, offering a few carefully chosen reflections that spoke of moral awareness without crossing into zeal or controversy. A sermon could be admired for its eloquence or for the gravity of its message, but never should one dissect doctrine too sharply or reveal the inner workings of personal faith, for such boldness would have been as improper as raising one's voice in the quiet hush of a chapel. Concerts, too, provided a common language, and here one might express appreciation for the delicate strains of a violin or the grandeur of a symphony without ever appearing excessively swept away. To praise a performance in moderate terms neither with cold detachment nor with unbridled enthusiasm was to signal one's cultivation, for the Victorians believed that taste was shown not in the intensity of one's response but in the discipline with which it was expressed. In such matters, moderation was the highest form of artistry, and every word became a thread woven into the fabric of one's social identity. To stray from these accepted topics, to venture into politics or personal opinions, to reveal too much of one's inner life, was to risk unsettling the fragile equilibrium upon which polite society depended. The drawing-room was not a place for argument, nor for confession, but for the steady rhythm of conversation that flowed like a carefully composed melody, never too loud, never too soft, never straying from harmony. In this way, the spoken word became another form of attire, a garment of sound that cloaked the self just as clothing concealed the body, And to master the art of conversation was to dress one's mind in the same layers of modesty and decorum that society demanded in every other aspect of life. Just as every thread of conversation was expected to remain within the soft hues of moderation, so too was every opinion carefully trimmed of sharp edges. For in the grand theater of Victorian society, the expression of strong or passionate views was not admired but feared, as though it were a crack in the polished surface of civility that might reveal something dangerous beneath. To speak boldly, to argue forcefully, or to assert one's convictions without the tempering veil of restraint was not a sign of intelligence or strength as some might imagine in later ages, but rather a mark of vulgarity, a breach of the code that set apart the refined from the rough, the genteel from the common. Those who gave voice to fiery opinions were swiftly judged as lacking the subtle discipline expected of their station, for boldness of speech was thought to belong to the marketplace or the tavern, places where coarse laughter and heated arguments echoed without shame. In the drawing rooms and parlors of the respectable classes, such behavior would have been akin to walking in with mud-stained boots or raising one's voice in church, a jarring and unmistakable sign that one did not belong. It was not only considered impolite, it was believed to betray a certain social inferiority, for the very ability to suppress strong passions and to present one's thoughts in gentle, measured tones was viewed as a hallmark of breeding, an inheritance of discipline passed down through generations. Thus, one learned early to smooth over the edges of conviction, to speak not in absolutes but in suggestions, to avoid the peril of "I believe," and instead retreat into the safer territory of "it is said" or "one hears." Opinions were best served diluted, wrapped in phrases so delicate they could not cut, like a cup of tea softened with milk and sugar until its bitterness was almost imperceptible. To raise a subject with too much certainty was to risk not only social disapproval, but also silent ostracism. For while open scolding was rare, a guest who displayed such improper zeal might find fewer and fewer invitations arriving at their door. And so, in a society obsessed with appearances, the suppression of strong opinions became another mask one was expected to wear. To speak in moderation was not merely a choice but a performance, a declaration that one belonged to the cultivated classes who placed harmony above honesty, elegance above candor. In such a world, silence could often be more eloquent than speech, and the refusal to reveal too much of one's inner self was regarded not as emptiness, but as refinement, proof that one understood the invisible lines that divided the acceptable from the unacceptable, the respectable from the vulgar. If the parlor was a stage for subtle conversation and veiled restraint, then the dining table was nothing less than a theater of order, a carefully choreographed performance where every seat, every gesture, and every bite carried meaning. Dinner in Victorian society was not simply a meal to satisfy hunger. It was a ritualized ceremony, a visible declaration of status, refinement, and one's place within the social hierarchy. To sit down at such a table was to step into a world where silence, glances, and the delicate clink of silver on porcelain formed their own quiet language, one that required careful study and flawless execution. From the very beginning, one's position at the table spoke volumes, for seating arrangements were not left to chance or comfort but dictated by rank, age, and the invisible web of social standing. The most honored guests were always placed closest to the host or hostess, while others were arranged with mathematical precision according to their titles, wealth, or connections. Even before a single dish was served, the hierarchy was established and reinforced, as though the very furniture of the room conspired to remind each person of their proper station. To be seated too far down the table was not simply inconvenient. It was a quiet insult, a reminder of where one stood in the intricate ladder of society. And once the courses began to arrive, the true test commenced. Each dish demanded not only appetite but discipline, for every movement of knife and fork was observed, every reach for a glass measured against the standards of propriety. To use the wrong utensil, to eat too quickly, or to lean too far over one's plate was to betray ignorance of the code, a small slip that could ripple into lasting embarrassment. The table glittered with an array of forks, knives, and spoons, each one designed for a particular course, and it was expected that you would know without hesitation which piece to pick up. And when? This was not indulgence but performance. where elegance lay in restraint and grace was measured in precision. Conversation, too, was governed by unspoken rules. For the dinner table was not the place for deep debates or personal confessions, but for measured exchanges that added a gentle rhythm to the procession of courses. Laughter was allowed, but never too loudly. Stories could be told, but they must be brief, polished, and appropriate to all ears present. The host and hostess orchestrated the flow, drawing each guest into dialogue with careful balance, ensuring no one dominated and no one remained silent for too long. To dine in this world was to prove that one belonged not merely by birth or wealth, but by behavior, by showing that you could glide through the complexity of ritual with apparent ease, as though it were second nature rather than the result of years of silent observation and practice. Beneath the glittering chandeliers, with candlelight dancing across silver and crystal, the dinner table became a stage where refinement was displayed, judged, and remembered. A single misstep might be forgiven, but too many would be noted. And reputations, once stained, were slow to recover. Yet, as elaborate as the seating arrangements and conversations might be, nothing struck greater fear into the heart of a Victorian guest than the silent, gleaming army of silver utensils spread across the tablecloth like a coded puzzle waiting to be solved. Each fork, each knife, each spoon had its own precise purpose, its own moment of entry into the ritual, and though the rule was to begin from the outside and move inward with each successive course, the pressure of so many eyes watching made even this simple sequence feel like a treacherous test. For the unseasoned guest, the first clatter of the wrong utensil against porcelain could echo louder than a misplayed note in a symphony, a slip that seemed to reverberate across the candlelit table and mark the offender as hopelessly uncultured. Imagine the quiet terror of reaching for a fish fork too early, or mistaking the soup spoon for the spoon intended for pudding. These were not trivial mistakes but small social calamities, each one exposing a lapse in breeding or education, each one silently judged by the quick flicker of a raised eyebrow or the almost imperceptible exchange of glances between neighbors. To outsiders, it might seem absurd that the tilt of a knife or the choice of a spoon could carry such weight, yet within the strict codes of Victorian dining, such details were considered reflections of character itself. Polished silver was not merely about practicality. It was a mirror in which one's refinement, discipline, and suitability for polite company were reflected back. The anxiety this produced could never be voiced aloud, for admitting confusion was itself a breach of the mask of confidence one was expected to wear. Instead, guests often relied on discreet observation, stealing glances at the host or the most seasoned diners to guide their own hands, a delicate choreography of mimicry performed beneath the guise of casual ease. Every motion had to appear effortless, every pause intentional, as though the rules of the table were written into one's very nature rather than painstakingly memorized. Thus, what should have been a pleasant enjoyment of fine food became for many a delicate, balancing act between appetite and decorum, between the instinct to eat and the necessity to maintain flawless performance. In this world, a fork was never just a fork, and a spoon was never just a spoon. They were instruments in a grander performance, and the price of error was not simply a fleeting embarrassment, but a quiet mark on one's social reputation, remembered long after the last candle had burned low, and when the final course had been cleared away and the heavy scent of roasted meats, sweet puddings, and polished silver began to fade into the air. The evening would often turn toward entertainment, a stage every bit as delicate and coded as the dinner table itself. For in a Victorian household, one was not permitted the luxury of remaining a passive guest, simply sipping tea or sitting back in a chair. Participation was not only expected but orchestrated with quiet precision. It was a common practice for a host or hostess to invite a guest to step forward to the pianoforte, to recite a piece of verse, or to contribute some display of culture and refinement. For entertainment was not merely a diversion but a means of demonstrating one's breeding, education, and polish before an attentive audience. Yet, just as with every other ritual of this society, the rules governing such performances were paradoxical and exacting. A guest who declined too firmly risked appearing ungracious, unwilling to contribute to the shared atmosphere of sociability, and such refusal could cast a shadow over their reputation, whispered about later in drawing rooms and parlors. But at the same time, to leap up with visible eagerness was equally improper, for it suggested vanity and an unbecoming hunger for attention. What was required instead was a delicate balance, an appearance of modest reluctance, as though one needed gentle persuasion to reveal one's talents, followed by a performance that was polished enough to show refinement yet restrained enough to avoid the suspicion of ostentation. The result was an atmosphere tinged with both admiration and tension, as the chosen guests settled onto the music bench or stood before the room, hands perhaps trembling slightly beneath gloves, while the assembled company leaned in with polite anticipation. A song performed with the right measure of grace could win silent approval, perhaps even a nod from a respected elder or a discreet word of praise from the host. But a misplaced note, a voice too strained, or an air too self-satisfied could alter the perception of an entire evening. Even applause, when it came, was rarely boisterous. It was delivered in measured, polite rhythm, ensuring that admiration remained controlled and dignified rather than spilling over into excess. Thus, entertainment in Victorian society was never only about art or pleasure. It was another carefully choreographed step in the endless dance of social performance, a test of taste, restraint, and the ability to shine just brightly enough without ever blinding the room. Beneath the glow of lamplight and the rustle of gowns, every note played and every word spoken was yet another reminder that in this world, even leisure was ruled by etiquette, and even joy was bound by the quiet weight of expectation. And yet, the world of evening entertainment held layers of meaning far beyond the polite applause or the careful demonstration of refinement. For within these musical interludes, there often pulsed an undercurrent of something far more personal, something that could not be spoken aloud in drawing rooms where every word was weighed and every glance quietly judged. The pianoforte, with its polished keys and the soft flicker of lamplight reflected across its surface, became not only an instrument of melody, but also a subtle stage for courtship, a place where the rigid walls of etiquette softened just enough to allow feelings to slip through, delicately veiled in music. A young lady seated at the instrument was not merely playing notes. She was performing a version of herself for the room to see, her fingers moving with grace, her posture reflecting poise, her choice of piece hinting at her temperament. Yet it was when a gentleman, often a family friend or a carefully invited guest, stepped forward with quiet gallantry to turn her pages that the performance acquired a second layer of meaning, one that rippled just beneath the surface of propriety, his standing so near that he could glimpse the faint rise and fall of her breath, his hand briefly brushing the edge of the paper as her fingers danced across the keys, created a scene both proper and charged with a kind of restrained electricity. The act of turning pages, on its surface so trivial, was in truth a ritual charged with symbolism, for it required a synchronization of movement and an unspoken attentiveness to the performer's rhythm. A gentleman who turned too early betrayed inattention. One who turned too late left her faltering, her performance fractured. But one who moved with perfect timing, anticipating her needs with a seamlessness that appeared instinctive, was demonstrating not only courtesy but a quiet attunement to her, a harmony of mind and gesture that spoke volumes within the strict language of Victorian restraint. And the young lady, though outwardly composed, might feel a blush threaten to betray her, quickly concealed beneath a controlled expression and a steadying breath. For too much warmth shone in the eyes or too eager a smile could be seized upon by watchful relatives as evidence of impropriety. Yet within the boundaries of etiquette, beneath the watchful gaze of mothers, aunts, and chaperones, these small gestures became a form of conversation, a coded dialogue between two people who could not freely declare their feelings. The pressing of keys and the turning of pages wove together into a silent exchange of attention, patience, and subtle admiration, one that could linger in memory long after the final note had faded. Thus, music in the Victorian home was never just about melody or cultural display. It was a quiet theater where affection could be hinted at but never fully revealed, where the act of two people sharing a song under the scrutiny of society became one of the few safe ways for intimacy to flicker into existence. veiled in elegance and bound by rules, yet no less powerful for its restraint. If music provided a delicate stage upon which admiration could be disguised as accompaniment, then the quieter gestures of everyday interaction became the second act in this wordless play of restraint and longing. For true affection in Victorian society could not be proclaimed in bold statements or passionate declarations, but had to slip instead through the narrow cracks permitted by etiquette. A gentleman might never dare utter words that could set hearts racing in the reckless manner of novels. Yet he could lay his feelings bare in the simplest of actions, the offering of a poetry book chosen with care, its pages marked by a faint fold at a stanza that spoke of devotion disguised as general reflection. To the unobservant eye, it was but a volume exchanged between acquaintances, yet to the one who received it, the hidden meaning in that carefully selected verse was unmistakable, and the silent understanding between them deepened without a word spoken. Even gestures as fleeting as the adjustment of a chair, the light retrieval of a dropped handkerchief, or the offering of an arm when crossing a garden path became charged with meaning when executed with thoughtfulness. For such acts of courtesy allowed a man to signal attentiveness while cloaked beneath the mantle of propriety. Compliments, too, had to be measured with exquisite precision, never lingering too long on appearance, for such would border on impropriety, but instead cloaked in the safety of abstraction admiration for a lady's refinement of taste, her skill in music, or her graceful composure when navigating the subtleties of conversation. Each carefully chosen word was less about its surface meaning than the sincerity carried in its restraint, a promise that even the smallest acknowledgement was laden with significance. And the lady, equally bound by the invisible cords of custom, learned to respond in ways no less subtle. For a glance held a moment longer than politeness required, a smile softened at precisely the right instant, or the faintest brushing of fingertips, when accepting a book could serve as answers in this unspoken dialogue. Affection was not painted boldly in color, but shaded in delicate tones, like watermarks that only revealed themselves under certain light, visible only to those who knew where to look. To the wider world, the interaction seemed perfectly innocent, almost forgettable. Yet to those two at the center of it, the air between them carried a richness that could not be explained, a quiet knowledge that something had been shared, something too tender to name aloud. Thus, romance in such a world did not need extravagant gestures or grand confessions, for it thrived instead in these small exchanges, where every movement and every word was tempered by restraint, yet all the more powerful because of it, weaving a language of affection that existed just beneath the surface of social ritual, veiled but deeply felt, as fragile as lace yet as enduring as memory. If subtle gestures and fleeting exchanges carried the weight of hidden affection in public, then letters became the secret chambers where hearts could finally speak with a little more freedom. Though even here propriety draped its heavy curtain across the page. Among engaged couples, correspondence was permitted, yet it was never a space for unchecked passion or reckless declarations. Instead, the pen moved carefully, each word chosen as if it carried both a promise and a warning, weaving phrases that lingered delicately on the border between duty and desire. A gentleman might write of the weather, of the changing seasons, or of some small detail from his day, but nestled between those innocent descriptions lay the true message, a line that hinted at longing, a phrase that suggested the thought of her never quite left his mind. The act of writing itself was intimate, for to place ink upon paper was to leave a trace of oneself, a mark that would travel across distance to be touched and read by another. For the lady, these letters were both treasure and test, cherished tokens she might revisit when alone, yet always aware that each response carried as much meaning in its restraint as in its warmth. Too much ardor risked impropriety. Too little might seem cold. And so she composed her replies with equal care, blending observations about family and social duties with subtle signals of affection, meant only for the one who knew how to read between the lines. A mention of a flower blooming in her garden might suggest her own quiet joy. A reference to a melody played at the piano could recall a shared moment. And even the way she chose to close the letter with a word more tender than expected, or a phrase that lingered with suggestion, could stir the imagination of the man who unfolded the page. These letters became more than communication. They were artifacts of devotion, safe in boxes, pressed between books, or tied with ribbon. each one a fragment of intimacy preserved against time. The paper might yellow, the ink might fade, yet the emotions carried within them remained vivid. For the act of writing allowed the couple to step momentarily outside the strict gaze of society. Though still bound by convention, the written word granted a quiet permission to speak in a voice slightly softer, slightly truer, than one could dare in a crowded drawing room. In these private correspondences, love breathed more freely, not in grand confessions, but in carefully veiled sentiments that resonated far louder than any public declaration ever could. And yet, for all the tenderness that letters allowed, the reality of an engagement remained a careful balancing act, one where love was promised but never permitted to unfold unchecked. Society drew its lines firmly, and even a betrothal, sealed with the approval of families and surrounded by anticipation of marriage, did not free a couple from the watchful eyes of custom. If they appeared together in public, it was never without the steady presence of a chaperone, usually a mother, aunt, or elder sibling, whose quiet authority served as both guardian and reminder that affection must remain measured, respectable, and above reproach. Imagine a young couple strolling through a park or attending a concert, two hearts bound by commitment. Yet their steps are paced not only by each other's rhythm, but also by the deliberate distance required to show restraint. A gentleman might long to take his fiancée's hand as they admire the roses in bloom. But such gestures could only occur if witnessed and sanctioned, for to be alone together too soon was to risk whispers that could unravel reputations before vows were ever spoken. Conversations, too, unfolded under this invisible weight, every word spoken with care, each laugh softened so as not to suggest too much delight in one another's company. The presence of a chaperone was not merely practical, it was symbolic, a living reminder that love was a privilege granted within boundaries, never fully private until the marriage ceremony declared it so. This cautious ritual of engagement underscored how much value Victorians placed upon appearances, for propriety was not only about what was done, but about what was seen to be done. A couple's ability to carry themselves with restraint, to honor the silent rules that governed behavior, became itself a testament to their readiness for marriage. If they could show patience, if they could endure the long months of measured affection, then surely they were worthy of the sacred covenant soon to bind them. Thus, even in the sweetest season of promise, love remained wrapped in formality, its flame shielded beneath layers of decorum, flickering quietly yet refusing to be extinguished. If a young couple believed their engagement was solely a matter of personal affection, they were quickly reminded that marriage in the Victorian world was never simply between two individuals, it was a union of families, reputations, and futures carefully measured against one another. Parents, ever vigilant, watched a suitor's every move with a discerning eye sharpened by years of experience, weighing not only his manners and speech but also his financial prospects, his lineage, and the circles in which he moved. A gentleman who charmed with eloquence yet lacked steady means was viewed with suspicion, while one of stable fortune but coarse behavior could be dismissed just as swiftly, for both wealth and propriety were seen as essential pillars of respectability. Siblings, too, often became silent judges in this ongoing evaluation. A brother might linger in the background, listening closely to the tone in which a suitor addressed his sister, testing whether his compliments veered too close to flattery or whether his opinions betrayed arrogance. A sister might watch the way he treated servants or elders, searching for signs of genuine character beneath the polished veneer of social performance. Every gesture, every glance, every silence became material for whispered conversations later around the family hearth, where the question was not only does he love her, but more pressingly, is he truly worthy of her and of us? These evaluations were relentless, stretching beyond the private walls of home into public gatherings. At a dinner party, a father might notice whether a suitor remembered to pull out a chair for a lady, or whether he overindulged in wine, small details that revealed more about his discipline than hours of polite conversation. At church, a mother might watch how he bowed his head in prayer, interpreting reverence or distraction as signals of his moral fiber. Suitors were tested again and again, not through direct confrontation, but through constant, unspoken scrutiny that weighed every action like evidence in a trial where the family's approval was the ultimate verdict. To win the affection of one's beloved was challenging enough, but to win the trust of her family was a far greater conquest, for their judgment could tip the balance of a courtship. Many young men discovered that a poorly chosen word or a careless gesture lingered in memory far longer than a bouquet of flowers or a flattering remark, and so they moved with deliberate care, knowing that love in this era was not merely a private affair of hearts, but a public negotiation of honor, standing, and collective destiny. Yet even the careful watch of parents and siblings was only part of a larger, more intricate calculation, for in Victorian society, marriage was never simply the union of two hearts. It was a binding contract between families, woven tightly into the vast web of class, reputation, and social aspiration. Affection, while not dismissed entirely, was expected to exist within boundaries defined by status, and so a match was always measured as much by what it could bring to a family, standing as by the personal happiness it promised to the individuals involved. A young woman might find her heart stirred by the gentle attentions of a man of modest means. Yet if his fortune or pedigree fell short of her family's expectations, the path to union could become fraught with obstacles too steep to overcome. For the upper and aspiring middle classes, these considerations were inescapable. A father might see in his daughter a suitor not only a potential husband but also an opportunity to secure alliances with families of influence, to elevate his household's position in the social hierarchy, or to preserve the wealth and land that safeguarded their legacy. A mother, no less calculating, might gently remind her daughter that love could blossom in time within a marriage built on stability, but poverty or social disgrace could crush affection as swiftly as winter frost withers a rose. These quiet admonitions carried great weight, for in an era where family honor was bound up with appearances and connections, the choice of spouse reflected not only personal desire, but also the collective destiny of generations to come. Even among the young, this truth was seldom forgotten. Courting couples moved through ballrooms and drawing rooms with a double awareness of their private longing and of the eyes that judged whether their bond would elevate or diminish the names they bore. Love poems might be exchanged, stolen glances might be cherished, but always in the background lingered the unspoken question, does this match strengthen the family? When the answer was yes, affections were nurtured, even celebrated. When it was no, lovers could find themselves torn apart by forces far larger than their own hearts. Their stories reduced to cautionary whispers of what happens when desire dares to ignore the dictates of class. In this way, romance in the Victorian world became a delicate balancing act, where genuine affection had to align with the rigid demands of social order. To marry without regard for class was to risk more than gossip. It was to jeopardize a family's honor, to cast shadows upon future generations, to disrupt the fragile equilibrium upon which polite society rested. And so, for many, love was pursued not as a wild passion, but as a carefully measured partnership, its flames tempered by duty, calculation, and the ever-present weight of reputation. Beyond the calculated alliances of courtship and marriage, Victorian women were also expected to embody a sense of moral duty that extended beyond the walls of their homes. And one of the most socially acceptable ways to do so was through acts of philanthropy. Charitable work provided an outlet where women could display compassion, piety, and refinement, all while strengthening the moral standing of their families in the eyes of the community. It was not unusual for ladies of good breeding to gather in church halls or drawing rooms to sew blankets for the poor, to prepare baskets of bread for widows, or to contribute their time to soup kitchens that promised warmth and sustenance to those left vulnerable by industrial hardship. These gatherings were not simply about the act of giving, they were occasions of performance, where benevolence was displayed in ways that quietly reinforced the family's reputation for kindness and moral uprightness. To be seen engaged in charitable work was to demonstrate both humility and refinement, for philanthropy allowed women to inhabit a public role without ever transgressing the boundaries of modesty or propriety. Unlike the sphere of politics, commerce, or professions still largely closed to them, charitable societies offered a rare opportunity to step beyond the domestic realm, to exercise a form of influence that was both indirect and socially celebrated. A young woman might join her mother in a committee meeting for a winter relief fund, her presence noted approvingly by neighbors who would later speak of her diligence and good heart. Yet even in these seemingly selfless endeavors, the unspoken awareness of class persisted, for the act of giving was as much a reinforcement of social order as it was an expression of generosity, with benefactors and beneficiaries divided by invisible lines of rank and privilege. Still, within these charitable rooms, something more subtle was at work, as women gathered to fold clothing, ladle broth, or stitch quilts. They were not merely practicing kindness but also creating spaces for companionship, shared purpose, and even the quiet exchange of ideas. In these circles, bonds of friendship could flourish, alliances could be formed, and young women might gently expand their sense of the world beyond the narrow confines of drawing rooms and parlors. Philanthropy, then, became both duty and opportunity, a respectable mask behind which women could experience the faint stirrings of independence, while still upholding the ideals of service, modesty, and respectability demanded by their time. In much the same way that philanthropy was a performance of virtue played out before the eyes of the community, the act of proposing marriage was never simply an intimate exchange between two hearts, but a carefully staged ritual where formality and restraint were paramount. A gentleman who had courted a young lady with measured attentions and quiet gestures of admiration would eventually be expected to declare his intentions. Yet even in this most personal of moments, privacy was rarely permitted. Proposals were often orchestrated within drawing rooms where a parent lingered, just beyond the threshold, or within gardens where the rustle of skirts or the creak of a chair betrayed the presence of watchful relatives. The words spoken might carry the depth of personal feeling, yet they were delivered in tones so carefully moderated that they could have been mistaken for a polite exchange about the weather. The significance of this formality lay not in passion but in propriety, for the proposal was as much a contract between families as it was a declaration of love. To kneel too ardently, to speak too freely, or to appear swept away by emotion risked unsettling the delicate balance of dignity that society demanded. Instead, the moment was marked by a controlled gravity, a sense of reverence that underscored the seriousness of what was at stake. For the lady, her response was equally bound by restraint. A blush, a faint smile, or a softly spoken assent carried more weight than any dramatic declaration ever could. In fact, to display too much enthusiasm would have been judged unseemly, suggesting a lack of refinement or a dangerous eagerness unbecoming of her station. Thus, the marriage proposal, while deeply personal in its implication, unfolded as a performance with an audience, both immediate and extended, for the news would travel quickly through drawing rooms and across dinner tables. Families would discuss it not in terms of fiery romance but of alliances, suitability, and the reputations that would be joined together. What might, in another time or culture, have been a private vow of devotion became, in the Victorian world, a solemn social act performed with care, restraint, and ever-present awareness of how it would be judged by others. Yet even when a proposal was accepted, and the two individuals found themselves bound by a promise that would soon alter the course of their lives, emotional expression remained subdued to the point of near invisibility. The very weight of the occasion seemed to demand silence rather than exclamation, a lowering of the eyes rather than an embrace. And perhaps, if propriety permitted, the briefest and most tentative touch of the hand, that small gesture, so fleeting and carefully measured, often carried more meaning in Victorian society than any spoken declaration, for it was intimacy cloaked in restraint, affection wrapped in discipline. It was not the fiery embrace or passionate kiss that one might expect when two hearts pledged themselves to one another, but rather a delicate acknowledgement that love existed and would now be formalized within the rigid boundaries that custom allowed. This suppression of outward emotion did not mean that feelings were absent. Rather, they were expected to remain hidden beneath layers of composure, revealed only in subtle glances, in the quiet tremor of a voice, or in the warmth of a palm pressed gently against another. Society had trained men and women alike to distrust dramatic displays, associating them with impulsiveness and poor breeding. So even at the very moment when joy must have surged most strongly, both parties were compelled to disguise it beneath a veil of self-control. For some, this may have heightened the sense of romance, turning the simplest touch into a profound symbol, while for others it may have created an almost unbearable tension between what was felt and what could be shown. Thus, the engagement, though filled with deep personal significance, remained bound by a culture that prized restraint over spontaneity. Every action, every look, every restrained smile became part of the choreography of respectability, ensuring that love was acknowledged without ever crossing the delicate line into impropriety. And so, when the day of the wedding finally arrived, the culmination of months of planning and the careful orchestration of family expectations, the atmosphere was one of both grandeur and gravity. The ceremony itself was steeped in ritual, with every detail carefully arranged to reflect not only the sanctity of the union, but also the social standing of the families involved. Churches were adorned with cascades of flowers, their fragrance mingling with the heavy fabric of gowns and the faint scent of polished wood, while the order of the event unfolded with the precision of a well-rehearsed performance. Guests understood their places, both literally in the pews and figuratively within the intricate web of society's hierarchy, and every glance, every whispered remark carried the weight of unspoken judgment. Yet beneath all of this structure, amidst the solemn recitation of vows and the deliberate movements that seemed almost choreographed, there were moments where genuine emotion pierced through the veil of formality. The tremor in a bride's voice as she repeated her promises, the way a groom's sighs lingered upon hers even when convention demanded a downward gaze, or the subtle tightening of fingers when hands were finally joined. These were the flashes of truth that slipped past society's rigid codes. They were not loud, nor dramatic, but all the more powerful for their quiet intensity, revealing that even in a culture obsessed with restraint, the human heart found ways to speak. The ceremony might have appeared, to an outside observer, as a carefully staged tableau of piety and order, but to those within it, there existed a fragile balance between duty and feeling. The flowers, the music, the restrained applause of guests, all of it served as a frame for the private, almost invisible exchange between two people who, despite the presence of so many watchful eyes, managed to carve out a sliver of intimacy in the midst of formality. And in that fleeting exchange, when the weight of expectation momentarily gave way to the sincerity of love, one could sense the profound depth of what was truly being celebrated, even if the world around them demanded that such depth remain hidden beneath composure. Once the echoes of the wedding vows faded and the final strains of music dissolved into the air, the reality of married life began to take shape, a reality defined less by flowers and finery and more by responsibility, expectation, and the unyielding rhythm of daily duty. The bride, who only hours earlier had been the center of a public celebration, now found herself stepping into a role as clearly defined as the vows she had spoken, for society made no secret of what it demanded from her. She was to transform from a figure of delicate modesty into the quiet architect of a household, ensuring that every detail of domestic life ran with precision, that meals appeared on time, that servants, if they were fortunate enough to have them, carried out their work with discipline, and that the home reflected the prosperity, order, and respectability of the family within. This transition was not merely practical but symbolic, for the efficiency of a woman's household management was seen as a mirror of her moral strength and her worthiness as a wife. A disorganized home whispered of carelessness, while a spotless kitchen or a carefully arranged drawing room spoke volumes about her diligence, her piety, and her obedience to the invisible but unrelenting code of respectability. Yet alongside this expectation of order lay the equally heavy demand of submission. For though she might govern the household, she was never meant to govern the man to whom she was bound. A wife was expected to yield gracefully to her husband's authority, to accept his decisions without open protest, and to place his comfort above her own desires, as if the home itself existed not for her but for the preservation of his reputation and the advancement of his ambitions. And yet, within the polished silver, the neatly folded linens, and the soft flicker of firelight in the evening. There lingered the unspoken complexities of this arrangement. Submission, though taught as a virtue, often required a quiet negotiation, a subtle balancing of self with duty, of inner voice with outward silence. Many women learned to navigate these waters with tact, shaping their households into sanctuaries that bore their invisible signatures, even as the world credited their husbands with stability and prosperity. For beneath the surface of obedience, there often lay a deeper truth. The household, though ruled in name by the man, was sustained in reality by the endless, unseen labor and quiet intelligence of the woman who managed it. Yet even as young brides stepped into this new world of responsibility, many did so with a veil of uncertainty, for the knowledge needed to navigate the most private dimensions of marriage was often shrouded in silence and carefully measured words. Mothers, whose task it was to prepare their daughters for this transition, rarely spoke plainly about what awaited them once the doors of the bridal chamber were closed. Instead, their guidance came wrapped in restraint, cloaked in metaphors, and softened by the language of duty rather than desire. A daughter might be told that her role was to please her husband, to yield with patience, or to ensure harmony within the household, but rarely was she granted the clarity or openness that might dispel her anxieties. This vagueness was not the result of neglect, but of a cultural expectation that propriety demanded delicacy, that a respectable woman should never discuss such matters openly, even with her own child. And so, many young wives entered marriage guided more by hints and implications than by genuine understanding, left to decipher the mysteries of intimacy through experience rather than instruction. A mother might place a hand gently on her daughter's shoulder and remind her to be dutiful, to remain composed, to think always of the family's honor, but she would stop short of saying more, her silence speaking as loudly as her words. For some brides, this lack of direct preparation deepened their sense of unease, making the first days of marriage a time of confusion as much as celebration. Yet for others, the vagueness itself seemed almost protective, a way of easing them into a life that demanded submission and patience without overwhelming them with truths too stark for the delicate world in which they had been raised. In this way, the cycle continued, with each generation of women passing along fragments of knowledge wrapped in modesty, ensuring that intimacy remained a subject whispered in shadows, never spoken in the clear light of day. If spoken words in public had to be measured and restrained, then it was in the private exchange of letters that engaged couples found their most delicate form of freedom. These letters were rarely passionate declarations in the modern sense. Instead, they carried emotion like a secret pressed between the lines, carefully hidden beneath layers of formality and coded language. A young man might write of the beauty of the season, the gentle turning of leaves, or the melody of a bird's song, yet every metaphor hinted at feelings that etiquette forbade him from stating too boldly. His fiancée, in turn, might respond with a reference to a favorite poem or an observation about a quiet evening spent with family, her words chosen with equal care, her true sentiments left for him to uncover in the subtle rhythm of her phrasing. These notes, though modest, carried a weight far greater than their few lines suggested. Each folded sheet of paper became a vessel of intimacy, a private thread that bound two hearts together while the eyes of parents, siblings, and chaperones remained watchful. For a woman, receiving such a letter might be the most thrilling part of her day, the moment when her fiancé's presence was felt most keenly despite the physical distance between them. For a man, sealing his letter with wax and entrusting it to the post was an act of quiet daring, a way of affirming emotions that he could not yet openly proclaim. It was a game of restraint and revelation, where love revealed itself only through suggestion, through lines that required interpretation, and through the thrill of knowing that beneath the polite phrases lay a world of unspoken devotion. In this exchange, engagement letters became not merely correspondence but an art form, a secret dialogue where both participants tested the boundaries of propriety while savoring the sweet uncertainty of anticipation. And if letters provided a private window into affection, then walks in the garden or along a quiet lane offered a more tangible yet still carefully managed glimpse of companionship. Even for couples formally engaged, These strolls were rarely private affairs. Instead, they unfolded under the discreet but unmistakable presence of a chaperone, often a sister, a mother, or an older relative who seemed to hover just within earshot. The lovers might walk side by side, their hands clasping gloves rather than each other, their words chosen with caution, their laughter softened to avoid any hint of impropriety. Every step was both liberating and restrained. For though they could speak more freely than in a crowded drawing room, they were never beyond the quiet watchfulness of family eyes. For the couple, these chaperoned walks held a peculiar charm: the rustle of leaves, the sound of carriage wheels in the distance. Even the faint scent of flowers in bloom seemed to heighten the intimacy of the moment, precisely because so little could be expressed openly. A glance held a little too long, a question asked in a tone that carried deeper meaning, or the deliberate slowing of pace to stretch out a few more minutes together. These were the quiet rebellions that transformed an ordinary walk into an unforgettable memory. The presence of the chaperone, though restrictive, added its own drama, for it forced the couple to communicate in subtler ways, to weave affection into the spaces between words, and to treasure the smallest gestures as tokens of a love that was carefully nurtured, but never fully unguarded. Thus, a simple stroll became both a ritual of propriety and a delicate dance of emotion, where the path itself seemed to mirror the tension between societal expectation and private longing. In the restrained rhythm of these walks, one finds not only the essence of Victorian courtship, but also the enduring truth that love often flourishes most poignantly when it is compelled to bloom in shadows. Yet for all the quiet beauty of these carefully monitored walks, there was always an invisible shadow hovering over every gesture, every glance, and every word. The fragility of reputation. In a world where appearances mattered above all else, a young woman's honor was a fragile glass that could shatter with the slightest crack, and once broken, it was nearly impossible to repair. A smile that lingered too long, a whisper overheard by the wrong ears, or even a chance meeting without the expected company of a chaperone could give rise to whispers that traveled faster than truth itself. In parlors and drawing rooms, in hushed conversations behind fans, a single rumor could transform admiration into suspicion, and suspicion into scandal, with breathtaking speed. This delicate balancing act meant that every decision carried weight far beyond the moment. A young woman might attend a ball and find her name linked, by mere speculation, to a gentleman whose reputation was less than flawless, and suddenly her future would be marked with doubt. Even those who loved her most, her parents or siblings, might feel powerless to shield her from society as judgment, for in the rigid code of the era, perception often outweighed reality. And so, she was compelled to move through her world with exquisite caution, guarding her words, her manner, and even her silences, lest someone read more into them than was ever intended. In this sense, reputation was both a crown and a burden, worn proudly yet heavy to bear. It granted her the possibility of a secure and prosperous marriage. But it also placed her under unrelenting scrutiny, a scrutiny that turned simple joys such as conversation, laughter, or even a passing touch into moments of quiet risk. And it is within this tension, between the desire for genuine connection and the fear of misinterpretation, that the emotional heart of Victorian courtship can truly be felt. For love was not only about affection and companionship, but also about navigating a labyrinth of unspoken rules, where a single misstep could alter the course of a lifetime. And if a lady's reputation was so delicate that even an innocent smile could be misconstrued, then the danger was doubled in the presence of those figures whom society quietly acknowledged yet rarely confronted directly. Every generation seemed to have its cautionary names whispered in guarded tones, men whose charm was polished, but whose intentions were far from honorable. One such figure, often invoked in hushed warnings, was Lord Barrington. Outwardly he possessed all the trappings of refinement, wealth, influence, and a smooth manner of speech that could easily enchant an unsuspecting debutante. Yet beneath that veneer, mothers and elder sisters knew enough to advise their daughters with subtle caution, never in explicit words but in the small gestures of guidance. A hand resting firmly on an arm to redirect a path across the ballroom, a sudden mention of fatigue to excuse a daughter from prolonged conversation, or an arranged interruption to prevent too much familiarity. What made these figures especially dangerous was not only their persistence, but the way society itself shielded them. For to speak too openly of impropriety was to risk scandal, and scandal often clung more stubbornly to the woman than to the man. Thus, families devised a delicate system of coded warnings and exchanged glance between mother and daughter. A father's sudden insistence that a dance card was already full, or a sibling's timely intervention with a change of subject. To those on the outside, it seemed nothing more than the normal rhythm of social interaction. But to those within the family circle, it was a silent defense against reputations that could be lost in an instant. For the young women themselves, the presence of such men was both a test and a lesson. They learned to read intent behind polite words, to sense when a gaze lingered a moment too long, and to gracefully maneuver away without drawing unnecessary attention. It was a constant exercise in vigilance disguised as charm, for to confront directly was considered unbecoming, yet to ignore the danger altogether was unthinkable. And so, in this intricate dance of civility and caution, a lady not only preserved her dignity but also demonstrated the strength of character her family hoped the world would see resilient, perceptive, and untouched by those whose admiration was anything but pure. Yet it would be unfair to view these dangers without also acknowledging the intricate web of protections that society, however flawed, tried to weave around its daughters. Etiquette, so often mocked for its rigidity and endless rules, also served as a shield and armor made of manners, gestures, and boundaries that, when carefully upheld, could ward off the worst intentions of those who lurked behind smiles. The very requirement that a young woman never walk unchaperoned, that she should not dance too many times with the same gentleman, or that conversations remain brief and restrained, acted as silent barriers against impropriety. To outsiders, these customs seemed stifling, but to those who lived within them, they offered a layer of security, ensuring that a lady's virtue was not left vulnerable to idle gossip or uninvited advances. Still, these codes were imperfect, for they relied on constant vigilance and the willingness of society to enforce them fairly. A clever man could still manipulate situations, maneuvering within the rules while bending them to his own advantage. And often the same structures that claimed to protect women also restricted them, making it difficult for them to speak out or to defend themselves when those lines were crossed. A lady who adhered strictly to the rules might avoid scandal, but she also risked being judged cold or distant, while one who displayed warmth or kindness could find her gestures twisted into evidence of impropriety. It was a delicate balance, a daily negotiation where grace and restraint became survival skills as much as social virtues. In this way, etiquette was both guardian and gaoler, offering protection, but at the cost of freedom. And yet, within the unspoken contract of these codes, families found reassurance that their daughters had at least a measure of safety, that they could step into drawing rooms and ballrooms under the watchful eye of society's expectations, carrying themselves with poise that doubled as a silent defense. For the women themselves, navigating these protective yet imperfect codes was an art, a performance in which every curtsy, every measured word, and every cautious smile became part of the armor that preserved not only their honor, but their very place within the social order. And so, after months or even years of carefully observed rituals, chaperone visits, and whispered exchanges hidden beneath layers of etiquette, the long-awaited wedding day arrived not simply as a celebration of love, but as a moment of profound transition. For the bride, it was the culmination of a lifetime of instruction. Every gesture, every smile, every careful step having led to this point where she would stand before family, friends, and the ever-watchful eye of society to take her vows. Yet even as the ceremony embodied continuity with all that had come before the formalities, the restraint, the carefully measured words, it also marked the threshold of a new existence, one in which the rules that had once confined her would subtly shift. No longer the young lady whose every movement was guarded by parents and siblings, she would now enter a household of her own, carrying with both her weight of responsibility and the tentative promise of freedoms that had been withheld until this very moment. Marriage, in this sense, was not a sudden liberation but a reconfiguration of boundaries. The bride stepped into her role as wife with expectations placed squarely upon her shoulders, duties to her husband, to her household, to the image of the family she now represented. Yet woven into these duties was a delicate thread of autonomy. For within the privacy of her new home, she could at last speak with her husband, without the ever-present filter of watchful chaperones. She could share thoughts more openly. And perhaps, in quiet moments, discover a kind of companionship that was shielded from the judging eyes of society. The transition was paradoxical. Once an extension of restraint and an unveiling of freedoms. A blending of duty and intimacy that defined married life in a world where appearances were everything. Thus, the wedding day was not simply an ending to one chapter, but the opening of another, where the carefully trained skills of discretion, grace, and self-command would remain essential, but where new bonds of partnership, trust, and private affection could begin to form. In this way, marriage was both a continuation of the old world of etiquette and the beginning of a more personal story, one that unfolded quietly behind closed doors, away from the grandeur of the ceremony and the watchful gaze of the community, marking the bride's passage into a realm where restraint and freedom would forever intertwine. As the ceremony reached its conclusion and the final blessings were spoken, all eyes turned to the newly joined couple as they prepared to step across the threshold of the church together. A moment that was never treated as a simple walk down the aisle, but rather as a symbolic passage into their shared future. The gentle rustle of silk gowns, the muted gleam of polished boots, and the hushed anticipation of the assembled guests all lent a heightened sense of importance to what might otherwise seem a small act. For in the collective imagination, this departure signified more than just leaving the building. It represented the couple's first steps into a life that was both their own, and yet still deeply tethered to the expectations of their families and the society surrounding them. The tossing of flower petals or rice, the music swelling faintly as they emerged, all became subtle markers of transition, delicate reminders that marriage was not merely a private union, but a public covenant, observed and endorsed by an entire community. Yet beneath the smiles and congratulatory glances, there remained an undeniable undercurrent of restraint, as though the freedom promised by this new beginning was still gently restrained by invisible cords of propriety. The bride, radiant yet measured, walked carefully at her husband's side, her every movement still scrutinized by those who judged not only her grace, but also her ability to embody the dignity of her new role. The groom, too, bore the weight of expectation, for his duty extended beyond affection into the realm of reputation, finances, and the preservation of his family's honor. Even in this moment of outward joy, both were acutely aware that their union would be continually interpreted as a reflection of the values, discipline, and respectability demanded by their society. The symbolism was powerful, yet it was also a reminder that the freedom of married life existed within carefully drawn lines, where personal happiness had to harmonize with social obligation. Thus, as the pair descended the steps of the church into the waiting carriage, and in hand yet still reserved, the act was imbued with layers of meaning, at once the promise of companionship and the continuation of the discipline that had defined their courtship. They had entered into a covenant not only with each other, but also with the eyes of the community, which would follow them long after the petals were swept away and the music had faded. Marriage was their beginning, but it was also an inheritance of expectations, a balance between intimacy and propriety that would shape the days and years to come. Even as the couple settled into the rhythm of their new life together, they quickly discovered that their every action, no matter how small or intimate, was subject to the gaze and interpretation of others. For in a society where appearances held as much weight as intentions, perception often overshadowed truth. A kind word spoken at the wrong moment or a gesture that lingered too long could be recast as impropriety, while dutiful silence or carefully staged gestures of respect might elevate one's standing regardless of the genuine feelings that lay beneath. This delicate balance between authenticity and presentation created a constant tension, compelling husbands and wives alike to perform their roles, not only within the sanctuary of their homes, but also before the ever-watchful eyes of relatives, neighbors, and acquaintances who wove reputations out of whispers and glances. A wife who maintained a graceful composure, who appeared diligent in her household duties and respectful toward her husband in public, was praised as the very image of propriety, even if her private life was filled with quiet struggles or unspoken discontent. Similarly, a husband who projected responsibility and restraint could be celebrated as a model of virtue, whether or not his private decisions always reflected such discipline. In this way, appearances became a currency, traded and exchanged in the marketplace of social standing, where a family's honor could be safeguarded or destroyed not by actual transgressions, but by how convincingly they upheld the facade of order, harmony, and moral strength. Thus, daily life became a performance of sorts, one that demanded discipline and subtle calculation, where truth was often carefully veiled in ritualized gestures, polite conversation, and rehearsed expressions that reinforced the image society required. The emphasis on appearances was not merely vanity. It was survival within a world where reputation was fragile, and where even the most unintentional misstep could cast a shadow that lingered for years. To live honorably, then, was not simply to act with integrity, but to ensure that integrity was seen, recognized, and affirmed by the collective gaze of the community. Carrying forward from the notion that appearances governed so much of daily life, romance itself often resembled a grand game of strategy, more akin to a slow and deliberate match of chess than to the spontaneous rush of passion that one might imagine. Each step of the courtship was carefully calculated, not only to reveal affection but to protect dignity, preserve family honor, and strengthen alliances that would carry weight far beyond the private bond between two individuals. A glance across a ballroom was not just a moment of admiration. It was the opening move in a long series of exchanges, each measured for its effect on parents, peers, and potential rivals who were all silently keeping score. Words were weighed with precision, compliments offered in moderation, and silences filled with meaning, so that even hesitation could be deployed as a tactic to draw the other closer without ever overstepping the bounds of propriety. For young women, this game demanded a delicate balance between openness and restraint, where too much eagerness could be interpreted as impropriety while too much aloofness might be mistaken for disinterest. Their smiles, pauses, and the slightest tilt of the head all served as signals that could either encourage or deflect attention, while mothers and aunts observed closely from the sidelines, ready to offer guidance on when to yield and when to hold back. For men, the challenge lay in displaying interest with just enough persistence to seem genuine, yet never so much as to appear desperate. For every action would be quietly judged not only by the woman herself but by her family and the broader social circle that would ultimately decide his suitability. In this way, the drawing rooms and gardens where courtships played out were not merely places of leisure but arenas where strategy and intuition danced together, shaping futures with every exchange. What made this elaborate performance all the more captivating was that beneath the calculated gestures, genuine feeling often blossomed in unexpected ways. A seemingly routine conversation about books or music could become charged with significance if a certain word was emphasized, or if a gaze lingered longer than etiquette permitted. Yet even then, restraint remained the rule, and true emotions were rarely spoken outright. Instead, affection revealed itself in coded language, subtle choices of phrasing, or the deliberate act of being present in the same space again and again, allowing constancy itself to become a silent declaration of intent. Courtship, then, was not merely about two hearts drawing nearer but about two minds maneuvering through the complex pathways of social expectation, where every move carried the weight of consequence, and victory was measured not in passionate declarations, but in the quiet triumph of securing both love and approval within the same delicate stroke. Yet for all the elaborate performances, the carefully measured words, and the endless calculations that defined romance as strategy, the truth was that the weight of such restraint could only be borne so long before the body and spirit cried out for release, and it was in the stillness of private moments that true relief was finally permitted to emerge. A young woman might pass an entire day under the unrelenting gaze of society, her posture rigid, her breath shallow beneath the constriction of whalebone and laces, her every smile chosen as deliberately as a line of poetry, and yet, only when the doors were shut and the lamps dimmed could she let out the sigh she had been holding since morning. The simple act of loosening the knots of her corset and feeling the tight embrace of fabric give way was not merely a matter of physical comfort, but a symbolic undoing of the invisible expectations that had pressed upon her all day. In those quiet hours, when the mirrors no longer reflected her for judgment and no audience waited to weigh her conduct, she was no longer the daughter guarding her family's reputation or the bride playing her part in a social performance. She was simply herself, fragile and unmasked, savoring the rare luxury of being free. For many, this private undoing became a ritual as significant as the grand ceremonies and dances that filled their public lives. The rustle of silk as it fell to the floor, the unpinning of hair that had been so carefully coiled into its daytime form, the whispered thoughts captured in a diary or in a letter never sent. These were the spaces where emotion flowed unrestrained, where longing could be acknowledged, where fears could be given shape, and where love, if it was genuine, could be remembered not as a strategy, but as a feeling that pulsed with its own life. It was in these hidden interludes that the heart gained back what the day had demanded, that the soul could breathe after being bound in silence, and that women could quietly reclaim ownership of their innermost selves. Though society might never see it, these nightly moments of release were often the truest expressions of humanity in a world that asked so much restraint. Proof that beneath the polished surface of appearances, there was always a current of deeply personal truth waiting for the chance to be felt. And so, when one steps back to take in the whole picture, the overall rhythm of Victorian life emerges as a paradox at once suffocatingly rigid and yet quietly tender in the small, hidden ways people managed to carve out their own spaces for connection. Every layer of society, from the drawing room to the church aisle, seemed governed by rules that dictated who could speak, how they might stand, and what emotions were permissible to show in the company of others. So much so that life itself began to feel like an endless performance upon a stage that allowed no improvisation. Yet, despite the strict order and unyielding codes of propriety, the human heart remained stubbornly alive beneath the weight of these expectations, finding its avenues of expression not in grand declarations, but in subtle gestures. Coded notes, or the simple act of walking together beneath a chaperone's watchful eye. The irony was that in a culture obsessed with appearances and restraint, it was often in the smallest and most fleeting of moments that people experienced their truest sense of intimacy and freedom. A stolen glance across a ballroom, the brush of fingertips while exchanging a letter, the hushed laughter that slipped out despite the pressure to remain composed. These were not only acts of defiance but quiet affirmations that humanity could never be fully caged by social constructs. What endured, even within such suffocating boundaries, was the resilience of individuals determined to preserve fragments of authenticity, to nurture affection in corners of life where it was least expected, and to remind themselves that love and connection could survive, even flourish, when cultivated in whispers rather than shouts. Theirs was a world shaped by restraint, yet it was within those constraints that they learned to weave meaning, proving that while society may have demanded perfection, the heart always sought something more real, something more profoundly human. As we close this journey through the carefully orchestrated world of Victorian courtship and marriage, it becomes clear that the society of that time was built upon a foundation of contradictions. On the surface, it was an age defined by discipline, order, and appearances, where every action was scrutinized, every gesture interpreted, and every relationship bound by a complex web of expectations that left very little room for spontaneity. Life was often a delicate dance between what one felt and what one was permitted to show. Performance where mistakes could damage reputations and silence could speak louder than words. Yet beneath this rigid facade, there was something undeniably human that refused to be extinguished: the longing for connection, the hunger for intimacy, and the quiet persistence of love, even when forced into the narrowest of spaces. We have walked with young women who knew that their worth was measured not just by their charm, but by their ability to maintain composure under the watchful gaze of parents, siblings, and society at large. We have listened in on whispered proposals, watched letters pass from one hand to another with words written in codes that only the heart could truly decipher, and observed how an entire culture tried to bind emotion within the framework of etiquette. And yet, We have also seen that emotion is not so easily bound. It slipped through in the form of hidden smiles, in the glimmer of eyes that lingered too long, in the quiet courage of a young bride who may have been frightened by the weight of expectation, but who still carried within her a spark of hope for genuine companionship. These fragments, small though they might seem, were the proof that authenticity always found its way, even in an era when conformity ruled almost every aspect of life. Victorian marriage, for all its ceremony and restraint, was never simply about uniting two individuals. It was also about binding families, preserving reputations, and upholding social structures that prized stability over passion. Yet for the men and women who lived within those structures, marriage was something more personal. It was a doorway to adulthood, a moment when one could step into a new role, however confined it might be, and search for meaning in the space between duty and desire. It is perhaps within this struggle that the true essence of Victorian life can be found, not in the rules themselves, but in the ways people bent them, worked around them, or quietly defied them in order to keep their inner worlds alive. And perhaps this is the lesson their world still offers ours today, in an age when appearances often seem to matter more than intentions, when so much of life feels like it must be polished for the gaze of others. There is something timeless about the courage it takes to hold on to authenticity. The Victorians remind us that while society may impose boundaries, the heart seeks its own language, even in the smallest gestures. A smile, a letter, a whispered word of affection. There exists the power to keep humanity vibrant. Their lives tell us that love, even in its quietest form, is not diminished by constraint but often made more profound because of it. As we step away from their world and return to our own, let us carry with us not only the images of silken gowns, candlelit drawing rooms, and strict codes of etiquette, but also the reminder that every generation, no matter how rigid, finds ways to nurture what is most essential: the longing to be known, the desire to be cherished, and the dream of finding truth in connection. Victorian society may have been rigid, but its people were alive with emotion, and in their quiet rebellions we glimpse something enduringly human: the search for real love in a world that often prefers the illusion of perfection. And with that, dear listener, our tale draws to a gentle close. May the echoes of this story linger with you not as a relic of the past, but as a mirror reminding us all of the subtle strength that it takes to live authentically. Until we meet again in another story, I wish you a peaceful night, filled with rest, quiet reflection, and the comfort of knowing that even in the most restrained of times, the human heart never ceases to find its way. Sleep well, and good night.